Hello. Today I want to talk to you about utilitarianism. In this lecture video, I want to talk about what is consequentialism, what is utilitarianism. In particular, we want to examine John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. I want to make a distinction between act versus rule utilitarianism, and we'll conclude our discussion by evaluating utilitarianism. So what is consequentialism? According to one influential definition, consequentialism are theories that hold that actions are right or wrong according to the balance of their good and bad consequence. So consequences matter. The right act in any circumstance is the act that produces the best overall result. There are many different types of consequentialist moral theories, but in particular, we want to study utilitarianism. And again, utilitarianism, there are many different theories out there, but in order to get a feel for what utilitarianism is, the best place to start is with classical utilitarianism. And classical utilitarians are Jeremy Bentham to your left and John Stuart Mill to your right. To guide today's discussion, I want to examine Mill's Utilitarianism. It's a book, it's a short book that John Stuart Mill wrote in which he explicates and explains his version of utilitarianism. One of the first ideas that I want to examine is the greatest happiness principle. And this is what he says about it. It's the creed which accepts as the foundational morality or utility, or the greatest happiness principle, which holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. So basically, what Mill is trying to say here is that the right action in any circumstance is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So what does Mill mean by the word happiness? And this is what he says. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, he means pain or privation or deprivation of pleasure. Mill says that happiness is the only intrinsic good. And this is what he says. That pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. And that all desirable things are desirable either for pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So what he means by that quote is that pleasure, right, whether bodily pleasure or mental pleasure, is the only thing that is valuable in and of itself. So here we have to make a distinction between intrinsic good and instrumental good. Intrinsic good is good for its own sake, meaning that it's good for no other reason than it is good for itself. Instrumental goods are good for the sake of another good. An example of this is money. Money is a good and we have reasons to value it. However, money is good for some other good, which is happiness or pleasure. So we seek to make money, not that because money is valuable in itself, but we use money to attain happiness and things of that sort. So far I said that according to utilitarianism, pleasure, or happiness is the only intrinsic good, and every other good is derivative of that good. But then that raises a question that Mill entertains in utilitarianism. Namely, is utilitarianism a philosophy or doctrine of the swine? Swine is a pig. And there was an objection circulating in Mill's time that utilitarianism is a doctrine of the swine because of its focus on pleasure. And this is what Mill says about it. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better or nobler object and desire and pursuit, they, the objector, designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine only worthy of swine. And Mill's reply to that objection is that no, human beings have faculties far more elevated than the animal appetites. And here Mill makes a distinction between higher order pleasure versus lower level pleasure. So the higher level pleasure are pleasures of the mind, and our capacity to enjoy those kinds of pleasures. But the lower level pleasures are more base forms of pleasure, kind of bodily pleasure that you get from eating food and drinking wine and so on and so forth. So what Mill is trying to say here is that the objector saying that utilitarianism is a doctrine of the swine assumes that human beings cannot tell the difference between higher level pleasure and the lower level pleasure. So Mill, poses this provocative idea. It is better for human beings to be dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, and better to be Socrates, who is a wise person, dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. There are three key ideas to utilitarianism. First, actions are to be evaluated as right or wrong by their consequences alone. And this is what characterizes utilitarianism as a theory of consequentialism. So utilitarianism is a subset of consequentialism. Number two, consequences are calculated by balancing happiness, pleasure, and unhappiness, pain. And number three, maximizing happiness or pleasure and minimizing unhappiness, pain are of utmost importance. Whenever we are evaluating whether an action is right or wrong, we want to look at the consequences of the said action. And you want to balance positive consequences, and you want to balance that against the negative consequences. So if the action produces more positive consequences over the negative consequences, then the utilitarian would evaluate that action to be right. But if the action produces more negative consequences over the positive consequences, then the utilitarian would judge that action to be the wrong action. Now, it is common for utilitarians to make a distinction between act versus rule utilitarianism. According to act utilitarianism, actions are right or wrong based on the overall happiness for the greatest number of people. Act utilitarians are only interested in the consequences of the particular act itself. Now, act utilitarianism is to be contrasted with rule utilitarianism. According to rule utilitarianism, actions are right based on their adherence to rules. So rule utilitarians evaluate actions according to their consequences, if and when it is or they are adopted by society in general. So the main difference between the two is this. Act utilitarianism asserts that an action is right just in case it, the action, produces the best consequences. On the other hand, rule utilitarianism asserts that an action is right just in case the action conforms to a rule, and it is the rule that brings about the best consequences, not the action itself. So now let's evaluate utilitarianism. First, I want to consider a couple of objections that John Stuart Mill considers in his own work. And then I want to highlight a couple of interesting points about utilitarianism. The first objection that I want to consider comes from Mill's own writing. And he entertains an objection that utilitarianism does not recognize self-sacrifice. And this is what he says in reply. He says that utilitarianism recognizes, and I quote, in human beings the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice is itself a good. So what he's trying to say here is that utilitarianism allows that you're allowed to sacrifice your or even your family's or your community's greatest good for the greatest good for others or greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, what it does not admit is that self-sacrifice is an intrinsic good. That self-sacrifice is a good for sure, but it's good only insofar as it maximizes the good or happiness for the greatest number of people. The second objection that I want to mention, and this is also entertained by Mill, is this. Utilitarian standard is intended for the moral agents or individuals' happiness only. And in response to that, he says, happiness, which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right or wrong in conduct, is not the agent's own happiness, but the happiness of all concerned. And he goes further to say that as between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires the agent, the moral agent, to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. You know, that sentiment or that argument has also been considered by a later utilitarian, Henry Sidgwick. He said that the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view of the universe than the good of any other. And this expresses the idea that each to count for one and none for more than one. That is to say that your happiness and your interest counts no more important than a stranger's. Another application of utilitarianism is that we can justify a democratic principle, one citizen, one vote. And this is a cherished principle in a representative democracy, such as the one that we have in the United States. One last application of utilitarianism is that it's really helpful to think about animal liberation or animal rights. So this is what Jeremy Bentham, the other utilitarian, says about animal rights. And I want you to pause the video to read the passage. So I want you to kind of focus on the very last couple of sentences. He says that the question is not can animals reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So basically, what Bentham wants to say is that as a society, we ought to take everyone's interest equally. And by everyone, he's including not only human beings' interest, but also animal interest. And animals have an interest not to suffer, right? So that's the basis by which we should think about animal rights and animal liberation. And then the one citizen, one vote, that should not be there. That's not part of Bentham's passage, so please ignore that.